plagued by an array of nightmares. The ones that still tore him from rest and sleep were the ones that had left the most impact on him. Those being the death of his family, the murder of his mother, the ruin of the small settlement where his people had hidden and thought they found refuge, and the sandstorms. Oh yes, the ravenous and insurmountable sandstorms of the East had left him with horrifying memories and vivid, inescapable recollections and waking moments. Reliving these events in scores, more so than that of all of the other dooms presented in all of his other memories combined. He had seen people he knew, desperate, running, reaching with outstretched hands and terrified faces, struggling to reach an outcrop or a boulder, or anything to hide from the coming winds, only to be too slow, too late. And in one terrible instant, a gust would take them. There would be a red mist. The sand and dust and particulate flecks of razor-sharp glass and metal would pass, leaving naught but a desiccated automaton with no extremities, all features sanded down, limbs and a smooth, bald skull of a head with no features. Sometimes just given enough time to realize what had just happened to them and that they weren't really there anymore, with dry stumps for arms and no face, they would try to scream, coughing up only bone fibers and dust before a second gust would come and do the mercy of carrying them off to be erased, made a small part of the vast predatory mass that was this living, haunting, man-eating type of sandstorm, which prowled the eastern desert in greater and greater numbers every year, slowly stretching their clawed, shimmering tendrils further and further west, searching for prey as they thirsted for any liquid. Blood, most likely. Why else such cruel and indiscriminate forms of near immediate desiccation? An old man who had been with them in their flight from the east used to try and upset and scare him as a child, telling him all of the horrors of the sandstorm and making him cry with a sick and cruel sneer. This old man had once told him that if the storm catches you, you live in that moment of raw, hewn, flesh-stripped agony forever as the winds carry you off. And the old man laughed and spit when he had cried, and his mother came running over to chase the old man off. Yet he had often wondered if that old man was still laughing when the storm had ripped him off the rock wall the group had been climbing, screaming for help from the others, as he watched his arms disappear before his eyes and lungs were taken. Is it any wonder that young Aziz often awoke, crying and screaming? Nightmares are different when you know the creature that holds you in a state of terror is real and has killed those around you before. And all you hear from these strange people in this strange city is that they keep seeing those same beasts on the horizon. To say Aziz did not do very well in his first month of coming to the city of Eruk would be a horrendous understatement. Having come to the city after running through dry eastern scrublands, he had collapsed a mile from the city gates, brought to the inner wall by a guard who was, himself, a father, had seen the boy go down from the wall. Running from his post, he brought the boy back in, avoiding being flogged for deserting his post by claiming Aziz had been from the orphanage, at least he had assumed. That was how he was told he had come here. After that, he was put into the orphanage, but suffered. Being singled out as a runt, he had been immediately knocked down to the bottom of the hierarchy. Having had very little interaction with other children, growing up persecuted and on the run. When they had asked him what gods he prayed to, he just answered Ishtar, his mother's religion. Some of the ruder boys at the orphanage had found this pitiful and had held him down and split his lip. Things just got worse from there, and eventually he slipped the wall at night and made his way far deeper into the city. Having found himself soon in considerably more trouble, it was only by chance, or perhaps exceptional fortune, that he was pulled up onto a roof by another boy, and out of the way of pursuing bell-worshipping thugs who had beaten up Aziz and taken his shoes, and also wanted his earring and his dignity. Now, out of danger, he would come to learn that this was Tani. Aziz had grown up with a strange mixture of being sheltered by his mother and completely doomed by his circumstances. Tani had been raised in circumstances almost the exact opposite. Having been sold into slavery to a mine by his mother for little more than some wine and a night of pleasure from some caravan man from south of some place called Rokana. After this, he had fled a collapsing mine and been left to the eastern kingdoms, spending 2 years moving from settlement to settlement and living off scraps before finding his way to Eruk. Now, compared to Aziz, he was thriving. A small camp set up on these rooftops, a set of 2 knives, clothing, a big bag of oranges with some sausages on a small cooking spot. Meanwhile, Aziz had spent the first 4 years of his life hiding out in between the walls of a partially abandoned house on the outskirts of Shumir. When Tani had asked why, Aziz had explained that there were some people who were very angry at his mother and her tribe for worshipping the goddess Ishtar. Wrong. Tani had said that sounded very odd, and Aziz had said that he didn't understand it at all either. While that was true, there was a lot he wasn't allowed to share with anyone. It was complicated. Considering that neither had been blessed with immense size or a particularly menacing appearance, they decided to stick together for safety, as Eruk was not exactly the safest place to be stuck out of doors. Unfortunately, Aziz had a good amount of trust beaten out of him by the old whore and her minions, and as such, he had a hard time falling asleep. That first night, they ended up staying at camp together. Children were often taught to sleep back to back in times when they're trying to remain safe and adults aren't around to protect them, but Aziz was still afraid. Part of this was also that even though they seemed to be doing well, Aziz didn't know Tani. That quickly became a past issue, as no sooner had Aziz said as such than Tani had given Aziz his second knife, telling Aziz he could hold on to it until they managed to get him something of his own, and had assured him that if he was planning to attack him in the night, he just made it a lot harder on himself. That was true. And while Aziz fell asleep holding the little sheathed silver razor, he slept soundly for the first time since he could remember. Breakfast had options: burgled eggs or lizard on a stick. Still unsure of his abilities when it came to stealing, they opted for lizard on a stick, which had to be done in trade with the large, gruff-sounding Zamorian man who sold this so-called fast food beneath the golden tusks. That said, 2 full bags of live lizards got a man 2 big lizards on a stick. Apparently this was called capitalism by the economic scholars in places like Philistia to the west. But to 2 scrappy boys, it was called absolutely delicious, especially the eyes. Crossing over from the roofs of Kubi, the boys made their way to an old hiding spot of Tani's, where it seemed he would need to remove the last few belongings of his, since he had given the space to a mother and her two small children, who had lost their home to, well, the type of bell-worshipping hounds who would kick a woman and her children out of their home after breaking down the door. To be fair, it had not been that nice of a place to begin with. At least what Tani had left her was dry, and had one other family living nearby, who just minded their own business and kept to themselves. Aziz had apparently come across Tani when he was in the process of relocating. He had spotted a new hideout, and it would have plenty of space for both Tani and Aziz, and perhaps some girls should they find themselves wanting company. And you can believe Aziz was on board with that. However, it wasn't going to be that straightforward. To get back into his old hideout, from where they were now, they'd have to sneak into the Narrows and cross into Ninurta, which was just block after block of sandstone housing for workers and artisans, slave housing and the bunkhouses. Dense and rather dangerous late at night. The new hideout would be at a spot right near the wall, high up, where it would be hard for people to reach them, let alone cause problems. North into Ninurta, and with a hell of a view. Southern Ninurta, on the other hand, was where the trouble lay spread out. This was the Narrows, a maze of muddy, stagnant canals with crumbling bridges, and half lived in wrecks of buildings by blocks. This is where whores and thieves vied for space, amidst cutthroats and prospecting slavers. And lost young women were said to disappear into the Narrows and make their way into long black skiffs, roped and gagged, never to be seen again as they were ferried away into the mist. The biggest problem with Kubi was that it was a bit eerie, mostly abandoned, and parts of it were starting to slough off and fall into the canal without much warning. Apparently, people said that there were days when it was once a thriving area with hanging gardens and tea shops. Tani had recently watched a rat drag down and eat a rather desperate-looking pigeon after fighting it in the ruins of a market garden. So those days must have been long, long ago. Tani had come from the southeast, and about as far east as Aziz. This much rain still caught him off guard from time to time. The biggest problem with the new hideout was its proximity to the old hideout, which was a temporary issue with a known solution. But the biggest problem with the Narrows was that it was dripping with crazy people and dangerous animals and every combination thereof. You'll find all types down in these Narrows. Cut purses, cutthroats, cut ties, and cut luck. Lot of cutting. Not a lot of string. The place was so chaotic and without reasonable form, it remained unmapped to this day. Far too untrustworthy. It was below the rest of the city, while still not being entirely underground. Woven up and down, in and out amongst the bottom rung of the old whore and her society. There were things down here Aziz had never seen, never wanted to see for that matter, but not knowing these things even existed before having seen them. He hadn't known to ask what to avoid. The scenarios were as dark a variety as the mind could conjure. People carving symbols into their skin because some god no one could comprehend or pronounce told them it was a good idea. People tattooing names and deeds onto their arms and hides because the previous gang's leader told them it was what they did. That type of diplomat was the type they had stepped over, after realizing he was going to choke on his own blood, and there had been nothing to do for it but move on and avoid trouble. They overheard some urchin girl coerced into desperate prostitution, learning to barter while at knife point, with the price being that she would be allowed to keep those pretty green eyes. For tonight anyway. They'd just get what they needed from her sister. And that on behalf of some coastal-dwelling fiend named Dagon, who made big demands, hated humanity, and paid his followers in corn? These narrows made no sense and smelled like some suburb of one of the more exotic foreign hells he had heard Aaron, a friend of his mother who had protected them, tell tale of. Even Aaron wouldn't have come to a place like this, crossbow or not. And he was surprised to hear from Tani, who had done a fine job of selling the character of this dark and rotten place, that there were ghettoed hellholes in the world that made this place seem like the palaces of the Padishah. And Aziz had looked at Tani dubiously, but Tani was dead serious. And Aziz had asked what those places were like. And Tani had said he didn't know personally, but a veteran man had told him of a demon-run city of thieves and killers called Zamora, where it was said that torches flared murkily upon uncouth revels in the shadows of a Zamorian narrow called the Mall, where the thieves of the East held carnival by night. And a strange shiver was sent down the back of the young Aziz, who at once thought that his friend's description was as close to a place like that as he would ever dare to go. But another part of him wanted to desperately see what was beyond that dark and shadowy line of such a place. Maybe when they were rich and could afford to hire some muscle. That seemed like a place that required some muscle to get answers and directions. Maybe a drink. Aside from some crossed footsteps with the more colorful denizens of the Narrows. They hadn't seen many others down here, and even though Tani had told Aziz this place was lost beyond mapping, Aziz wished he had a map anyway, if for any other reason to feel like he had some idea of where they were going. They crossed into rooms of empty cages once ruled over by slavers. Crossed into a room where a family was buried in the floor, and then another room with a man covered in names and numbers of tally sat in the darkness with his eyes wide open but seemingly asleep. Two dogs fighting over a human hand. A woman putting blood-tipped needles into the loins of a doll made from rags with far too much sadistic glee in her mannerisms to be healthy or sane. Then they opened a door onto an explosion of violence and fire. As a man the size of a bear came charging through the door, which Tani had just spent the last few moments carefully trying to pick open in absolute silence, pressing himself against the wall at the last second as the door erupted into a rain of splinters and questionable carpentry, as another slightly shorter but vastly wider man came slamming into the first man. In a whirlwind of fists and cursing and guttural barbarian sounds from the heathen north. And it was all very up close and personal, and smacked of the type of situation you would want to be watching from the safety of the cheap seats. Certainly not right up on the front row where you might get blood on you, and a good amount of that blood might just turn out to be your own. And no sooner had they ducked and run past the two behemoths tearing each other to pieces than they realized that they had just run past the two runts of this bear clan, and that the big boys were all painting the courtyard arterial red. Aziz had no idea how that made a damn lick of sense, but Tani explained that size was relative to size, and Aziz just shouted back how that really didn't matter when everyone was 3 heads taller than you to begin with. And to their mutual surprise, both ducking into a closet which had crumbled from within, making it into a door, they found themselves on the opposite side of the Narrows, and both of them in one piece. alive and covered in blood, but it was with other people's blood, so that wasn't nearly as bad. No, it was a completely different kind of bad. And Aziz had someone's eyeball stuck dangling on the end of his earring. Tani, good lad that he always tried to be, did away with that little bit of unpleasantness when Aziz was looking around, wondering how all of that was going on in there, and yet it was just business of the night as usual out here. And Tani explained that Eruk was kind of a wild place for the uninitiated. And Aziz had asked if they had been initiated, what with picking half the locks in the Narrows and surviving an actual barbarian brawl in the likes of the deep dens. And Tani said that it wasn't up to him. Likely decided by some mad old wizard surrounded with smoke rings and shadows and jinn and the like, all sat council with the mysterious and ancient king of all rats known to humans only as Ozymandias, with his glowing emerald eyes. And them being initiated or not, all likely came down to dice and pre-Euclidean geometry. And Aziz asked what that meant, and Tani said he had no idea. It was all just according to a merchant he had been talking to a while back, who seemed to know all manner of assorted, esoteric weirdness. And Aziz asked what that meant when they needed to move on, as the commotion back inside was threatening to follow them outside to fight under the stars. Either way, neither of them knew themselves privy to any of that sordid business of demons and dice and maths. Of all things, oh, gods, no, anything but that. But what they did know was that Tani's old haunt was closer than ever, and it was getting late. Sleep would be a nice thing indeed. Something was always burning around the old whore. Eruk just had to have fire. Whether or not it was good or bad could come down to the wind. So they hadn't thought it too concerning as they walked and talked quietly between themselves. Tani really only had one thing he truly needed from this old place. Aziz hadn't expected to hear that, both relieved that they wouldn't be trying to navigate this madhouse of a lower city while carrying much, but now also wondering what all the fuss was coming down here. What was so important? Tani hadn't explained much about his upbringing, since it wasn't exactly a time he liked discussing if he could help it. It was just one mishap or another offset by some manner of good luck. He had, for example, the misfortune of being born to a woman who was at the absolute bottom of society, who truly hated him. She had said so herself on one of the many nights where the alcohol wasn't dulling the crazy. He hadn't been raised by her, not in the slightest. Instead, another woman had raised him. Her name was Roxana, and he had been very lucky to have had her near him. She was who he would much rather think of as his mother. He just had the bad luck of knowing exactly where he came from. Both his mother and Roxana being slaves. Tani was himself already born into slavery. However, there had been no interest in him, as he had been deemed a runt. Roxana had defied the wishes of the slavers when she kept him, and she was eventually punished for it by being sold to a caravan, in which rude men with strange narrow eyes and many rings lusted openly after her foreign, exotic Shemitish beauty. His blood boiled thinking back to how they had handled and inspected her. When he got mad like this, he could almost smell it burning inside of him. Or maybe that was just the local char. Seemed to be that kind of night. Embers were about, something nearby was setting the mood. Regardless, they had bought her, and claimed she was to be taken with them back to where they came from. A place called Yamatai, in the east. And Tani had said that someday he was going to go over there and bring her back. Aziz had never heard of a place called Yamatai, and Tani said it wasn't on any of the maps he had ever seen either, and that it was far past even Hircania. Aziz didn't really know where that was either. Tani explained it too was far away, but Yamatai was further. Maps existed, he just needed to find them and then he'd be off. Before she had been taken and pulled from his arms, Rakshana had given him a bracelet made from a lock of her silken black hair. That was what they were going to retrieve, as he had always kept it nearby. But it had fallen out when he had packed his bedroll in which it was tucked. He felt stupid, but Aziz told him it was very sweet, him going back for it. As they turned the corner, Tani's face turned ashen white as the night revealed the source of the burning scent that had filled the air. Somebody really needed to make a request of the king or the council or whoever Aziz would need to take these pressing matters to in Eruk. That it must be made illegal to burn a boy's home down until nothing was left but 2 crackling wooden beams and a blackened foundation. Aziz would do it himself, but he couldn't read or write. And then for the sky to have the sheer clouded audacity to have it rain after the fact. Rain right onto the kid coming home to find this ruin. That's like the sky punching a man when he's down. Aziz had never seen Tani cry. Still hadn't. He was taking the loss of his current home and his one remaining sacred piece of property quite well. Besides, Aziz was more than capable of doing the crying for both of them, but did so quietly, reserved, sidekick-like, no whinging. Aziz had his arm around Tani as they looked out over the city and the next step of the journey which would hopefully see them to a new hideout. Aziz had set up the camp on the roof over a far less savage-looking market and plaza, and he let Tani sleep for a while. Sleep was helpful for both of them, as Tani seemed to now focus on their next objective, and Aziz just liked extra sleep. Being further away from the narrows and the canals, there was fresh water flowing through these far more well-maintained public wells and concrete tributaries. The boys were able to wash off a good amount of that dried blood and local color they had picked up the previous night. Aziz really was a small little thing. Tani had always hated the word runt, and still getting called so himself from time to time, would never use such a title to describe his friend, but he could see why people did. What really made this boy a walking archery target for some folks' more misanthropic sense of boredom was that he was in no way streetwise. He was rather gentle and a romantic, very thin and in no ways tough. And looking at him, Tani saw signs he knew to come with long starvation on his friend. Wayfish is the word some would use. He couldn't really place where he believed Aziz to be from. He knew Aziz himself claimed to be from the southern kingdoms, but he didn't look like the people who came from the southern kingdoms at all. He had very light skin, but the facial features that certainly almost looked Stygian. He was rail thin and short, shorter than even Tani, and that was saying something. Having come down to bathe, this was the first time that Tani saw Aziz with his hair down. It was long and black with speckles of what looked like silver strands all throughout. For a boy, he was one of those strange specimens that would have been described by some as beautiful. Unfortunately, the people who used that term for boys like him were most frequently slavers, who wanted nothing more than to sell him all the way back to the east at a profit. He had heard horror stories that those beautiful boys often got turned into good little dancing girls by way of a few choice and life-altering cuts with a hot knife, so as to take the fight out of them, and it made him shudder. No, if things were to ever get that far out of hand, Tani had it in mind to just tell Aziz to run and hope for the best, since it looked like if the kid ever did throw a punch, it would likely just hurt his wrist. Aziz himself had even said to Tani that he was rather useless in a fight. But with that said, he hadn't run or crumpled into a ball sobbing when swords and arms were swinging all around them and had crept the Narrows all rogue-like, right behind Tani. So he wasn't a coward. Just knew he had some size limitations. It was around this time that Tani caught himself staring at Aziz. Only after Aziz caught Tani staring at Aziz, and both blushed bright red. Aziz's hands immediately going to cover his assets. Which was funny because Tani hadn't been looking. Putting Aziz at ease, he mentioned that he still had some blood on his shoulders, which Aziz seemed to believe explained Tani looking at him for a bit longer than expected. Later in the morning, they passed by the hideout Tani had so forfeited for the place which had burned down, and was most pleased to see that the two small families had seemingly combined into one. Not wanting to interrupt the morning routine, as the children were sleeping in and the man with the boy and dog and woman with her two kids were seemingly working on another family member or two, making very sweet sounds with one another quietly. The boys left them to their romance and good fortune, and Aziz took that as a good sign of the rest of the day, which seemed a bit odd to Tani at first, but perhaps he was on to something since, well, at least someone was off to a good start. Breakfast was found dates and lightly used bananas, with a side of pinched ale split between the two of them from a big tankard some rogue had left behind on a ledge. Overall, Tani seemed far more confident in this new hideout as they approached. He was leaving the old haunt for a reason. He kept pointing up while talking about it. That vexed Aziz. Coming to the top of the hill off the south of Anashir, Tani was able to point to it, just south of the Iprum Gate at the west of the city. Realizing where he was, Aziz also looked north and east. But scanning the horizon, he looked disappointed. Tani seemingly mistook this, or Aziz being a bit disappointed in the potential hideout atop the city, assuring his young companion that it looked way scarier and dangerous to get to than it really was. Crossing a public square currently being used as a forum for some artisan council, they turned onto a street further down than where they were heading and got turned around a bit in an area Tani knew by reputation as the Gray Market. Not dangerous, just a bit rough. The merchants and vendors had a coin's toss chance of preying to the likes of Bell. Aziz winced at hearing that name, and Tani saw that his friend wasn't a fan of the old fiend. Good. Bell had too many friends to begin with. While blasphemous to some, most of them were worshippers of Bel, so Tani could care less for offending that lot. He didn't believe Bel was a god or a demon, or even some low-level, greasy little fiend. No, Tani believed Bel was some gross, fat, oily human. Just some unscrupulous scumbag running his big, spooky eagle-elephant racket from some place like Shumir, or maybe up north in Zamora, where he was celebrated, not here. No, around here his followers and the old beast himself were feared, but also hated. Every town and city had its damn Bell worshippers, but they were like fleas, just because they were there didn't mean they were welcome. The kings of Shem and the magistrates of the city-states had all agreed that Bel gave the kingdoms a bad name in foreign lands, and his methods were heathen and degenerate. Merchants who prayed to Bel would prey on their clients, and men who prayed to Bel would prey on damn near anything. And Tani had come to conclude, by his own counsel, that he had heard far too many vile rapists grunting praise to Bel, and always at the expense of someone else. But what can one expect from the likes of man-shaped violent parasites who pay worship to a devil and believe the world owes them what they don't intend to pay for? And it was right around this time that the two boys noticed that the men who had been walking behind them for a ways were now walking a lot closer than either of them felt comfortable with. Having closed in as they had left the main road while Tani educated his street pupil on why to avoid the likes of the god of thieves, and Aziz had asked just prior to catching wind of the danger what a Bel worshipper tended to look like. And Tani was starting to explain, but turning around to face these suspicious pursuers, they immediately decided that flight outweighed fight when there were two of the bastards at twice their height. A man with a facial scar in the shape of a hook, and another with facial tattoos accented by metal rings drawn through his flesh. And as the boys started to run, Tani made mention that they often tended to look a lot like that. And as if he heard them, the larger of the two followed with a resounding,
"By Bel, men, we've got us some sport this morning."
And the one with rings in his tattooed face called out his claim to the pretty one. And Aziz looked right at Tani and said with all sincerity,
"Uh-oh, I think he's got his eyes on you."
And Tani really had to wonder how this freshly sliced cohort of his was somehow still alive in a city like this. Bel's bastard boys charging right behind them with malicious laughter echoing at pace. Having to run from thugs tends to rank somewhere near the bottom of those things folks set out to do after breakfast. But being chased by the bastard cohort of Bel is a particularly brisk exercise in demonstrating one's will to survive. See, when this lot is already fixing to just take what they want for free, they have no need to worry about costs to replace. They don't just want to hunt you or hurt you, no. These beasts want to savor the kill and enjoy themselves a while. And these were grown men with twisted appetites, and that look in their eye that you just knew came with a certain deep-seated sickness that made them thirst for young, healthy blood. Now Aziz was faster than Tani, but Tani stronger and more agile. Aziz pulled ahead by about a block. Though usually at the top of his game, Tani found himself struggling to keep up with Aziz. Only turning back in the split second to see Tani trip and go down hard. Tani saw it about to happen. He tried to stop and divert, but it all just came crashing down, and he left pink skin and blood on the concrete from knees and elbows. And he looked up to see Aziz, looked back to see Bel's boys closing in. And he didn't even have time to yell and tell his friend to run, because Aziz was already off. He turned the corner and abandoned Tani as the two men came up from behind to gloat and beat this troublesome brat to death, and then do some other things to him to drag him down all the way. Even though he had told himself he was going to tell Aziz to run, seeing his friend vanish without hesitation hurt, and he felt suddenly very alone and more frightened, and it read on his face. Aziz might have been blissfully ignorant of just what kind of monsters prowled the streets looking for young boys without parents in the name of Belle. But Tawny knew exactly what they had in store for him, and was struggling to maintain some semblance of composure until they got that from him. And even though he ran rooftops and picked locks, and boys like Aziz fancied Tawny something of a rogue, Tawny knew that he was just a small, scared, homeless little virgin like Aziz. Right now was one of those rare times when he was starting to feel like it too, and he hated it. The large man with the scar was slapping a metal bar pipe that looked like it weighed as much as Tawny. And off the main road in this dim alley, the other was undoing his belt, as this was going to happen out where these locals could get a good look. They grabbed Tawny by his arm, dragged him to his feet, and struck him hard. Tawny screamed as his world went dark, and he looked around as merchants across the street closed their stalls and locked their doors, all heroic-like. Nobody was coming to save him. They struck him again and groped him hard. Tawny let out a shriek. They grabbed his belt and yanked at it, trying to rip it off of him like greedy rats tearing at him. He tried to get at his knife but couldn't free his arm. These people didn't care, nobody cared, and Belle hates a weakling. And it was right around this time that Tawny's attention flashed momentarily behind the tattooed man. As in just a blink of an eye, there was a massive jet of blood and screaming, as the scarred man had suddenly had what appeared to be a carpenter's nail driven into his head, with a hunk of wood swinging off of it. And in his flailing, the scarred man spun around and smashed his pierced partner in crime so hard, the man's neck snapped in a truly ghastly direction. He crumpled like a pile of burnt dreck, and the man who was spinning in circles finally decided that he should probably lie down and just die. As he complied, gurgling to the floor in a dark red puddle, he revealed a sweat-dripping, hard-panting, big damn plank of wood-wielding, boy-sized brawler of myth and legend that was Aziz, who had taken off running at top speed, figuring scoundrels like that would waste time to gloat, and figured he had just as much of a chance of rounding the block and catching them off guard as they had sneaking up on the two of them. While he was initially hoping to find some sand or gravel to throw at their face, inspiration had apparently hit when he found just the perfect board with a nail sticking out of it. And fancying himself something of a traditionalist when it came to street brutality, he had decided that by the ancient laws of street warfare and skullduggerous combat, that this was all just fair play, dragging it up behind him with nothing but a hot burning shot of adrenaline and some deep-seated moral outrage on behalf of roguish young lads just looking to move house and walk home in peace. Tawny was shaking and stunned, his hands having to hold his leggings up by his belt as he just stared at Aziz with wide, shocked eyes, and held his belt tight as they had been trying to rip it down with the rest of him. Alone in the alley, standing there with the two bastard bodies of Belle's boys turning cold, Tawny fell and hugged Aziz. Even though it was quiet and no one heard, Tawny was sobbing and thanking his friend. Tawny had never been caught before, not like that. Sure, he had been pummeled or thrown into a canal once or twice, but these weren't street punks. Tawny hadn't really ever thought Aziz a coward. It would never cross his mind after this. A short while later, calmer, more collected with patched leggings and a repaired belt, and a bit less blood on him, they left the alley to its slow, secretive decomposition. As they left the area and doors started opening, a merchant had said that he wouldn't say anything and the guards could make up whatever they wanted. Aziz said that was very brave as he rolled his eyes. That night was the last night, oh gods, did they hope this would be the last night that either of these two scrappy boys spent sleeping back to back on the street. There might be some debate over the whole schooling and safety in numbers. All very good in theory. Just make sure a good number of your cohort in question isn't a secret enthusiast of the old slum and skullduggery. Make sure you have someone at your back that you can trust. They awoke early, Tani first, who then woke Aziz. They would need to make an early start. They wanted to be up the ladder, at least part of the way by the time the sun reached the height of the sky. Aziz and Tani were tired. Sleep was troubling. No real rest, but this was the best they were going to do. Camp split between them. It was a straight shot up near to the top of the wall in what he hoped was a secret alcove that no one had been to for a very long time. He trusted his source on the matter like he was blood. If it wasn't safe, Asher didn't lie. No. It would just be an unfortunate fact that what he had told Tani was no longer true. Nothing changes. Nothing stays the same. And it was then, from the ground near the western wall of Eruk, that they got their first real look at the place, and ooh boy, Asher wasn't kidding about its height. They might spend half the day climbing and not reach it. Straight to the top. Top of the world, boys. And maybe, if you don't run, coward, or slip and fall to your doom 400 feet below, you get the best seat in the entirety of the housing district. Best seat in the city. Just have to be driven. You might imagine they stopped and stared and had second thoughts, but nope. Started climbing straight up. And up, and up, and way, way up there. Not as tall as that strange tower that Aziz couldn't help but notice had disappeared from the horizon overnight, but Tani wasn't sure. Aziz didn't force the matter. There had been enough of that sort of rot yesterday, and he was feeling optimistic. No mysterious towers. Fewer bell worshippers up at this altitude. It was starting to feel rather exclusive up here with, like, company. Kinda nice. Leg over leg, hand over hand, hand over fist if they had their combined say in the matter. But please, oh please, don't let this spot be taken. Or imaginary. Up and up and up, and I swear, even if I keep saying up all damn day, it still won't be tall enough. I don't care how tall you've heard Eruk's walls to be. This chunk right here had something to prove to the tourists and those wandering doomed gazetteer readers. Climbing was tense. Nothing was a guarantee. Part of this ladder would need repair, or at the very least reinforcement. Each step felt like some man in a mask was rolling dice, and that felt wicked this high up. Then, without even fully realizing it, they reached the top. Swinging themselves up, arms burning, bodies dripping with sweat, hearts pounding, Tani climbed up and immediately grabbed to reach for Aziz, favoring the safety of his new friend over the make of the place as the first man to the top of his generation. And, oh, by the gods. It was perfect. I mean, how often do you find a high-rise, solid stone, reinforced entryway at the top of the city across from the market district at this price? This price being free is stolen, and oh, wouldn't you know it, it was actually around 3 times the size of what they thought. It had a roof in the back, and it overlooked the outer wall of the city at the top. The two ran around on the wood deck like mad men for about an hour, whooping and hollering. And if you didn't know any better, you'd think there were some kids up there doing kids stuff. And taking a look at their surroundings, they could look down at the city like gods. The view from up here felt like a living map of the entire layout of Eruk. Ooh, yes. The old whore, spilling all of her dirty little logistical secrets before their very eyes. And hey, would you look at that? When Aziz took a look in the direction he had gazed before, well, now he had the advantage of a god's eye view. Lord of all tiny white mice was he. And he saw a temple off near the far side of the center of the city. It was the Temple of Ishtar. He wasn't even upset it was in the wrong direction. It was there this time, just like his mother had told him it would be. And she would never lie to him or lead him astray. She had promised him that, just as he now promised himself to his new friend. Meanwhile, Tani couldn't help but notice that just for a fraction of a second, he could have sworn that the mysterious tower, that the young Aziz had absolutely just imagined, likely due to nerves, had maybe not been imaginary, as he had seen it now, too. And now it was Aziz's turn to have some fun with this, and he said, "Oh, sure, and I bet you're going to tell me there was some wizard with crazy eyes and a big black bird on his shoulder and a big ivory pipe in the shape of a mad old dragon." And Tani said, "You know, that was oddly specific, but no, it was a girl." And you could probably still, all these ages later, hear the echo of the massive groan and rolling of Aziz's strange violet eyes as Tani assured him that there was a girl that was staring at him from the top window. Oh, sure, with big gold earrings, gorgeous black hair, no doubt. And Tani said, oh no, it was wavy and brown and had gold woven into it like some kind of princess. And Aziz raised his eyebrow because it looked for the life of him like Tani was believing this dreck, but said, grinning, "Aha, now who's being oddly specific?" And as for the little girl hiding out in the Tower of Konzel, well, she thought herself to be very clever indeed. As not even the wizard himself knew that she was hiding all the way up here. Well, I guess that'll be your little secret for right now.